what is a Bitcoin Treasury company? Well, there's been different forms of this, in my opinion, over the last 5 or so years. To take MicroStrategy as an example, and specifically for me, back in 2020, again, you may have heard me speak about this, but it's a genuinely life-changing moment for me. I watched a YouTube video called Bitcoin Infiltrates Corporate America, and it was Raoul Pal interviewing Michael Saylor, and it was a 2-hour-long interview, basically like, who are you? What have you done? And he's like, well, I'm boom, 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 lists out of all of his credentials. And I think this is still true. He's the longest serving founder, CEO of a business listed on the NASDAQ. Like, an extraordinary statistic in itself, right? Founder-led business, still run by the founder, still majority controlled by the founder, still, it's wild what he's managed to do. But what really caught my attention in that interview was, how do I know that 100 years from now, the manager of my company has the best chance of survival? And that was a lens that really spoke to me as someone who'd received an inheritance and wanted to make sure that the next generation and the generation after that got what I was given, if not more, right? How can I pass this through to the next generation? And MicroStrategy was the first example of a publicly traded equity that became a Bitcoin Treasury business that I looked at very closely. And what does that really mean? Well, most companies that are traded on the stock market are traded based on their operations. So what do they create? Who do they sell it to? How much of that shit are they selling? How profitable are they? That is a business operation, right? It's not a balance sheet necessarily. And there's lots of different ways of valuing a company, of valuing an equity. But I would say that MicroStrategy was the first example of someone who's like, okay, I'm taking my Treasury reserve, as it is described, basically their cash reserves as a business, and they reallocated the entire lot into Bitcoin. And I think his first major move was around 250 million US, that quickly got close to 400 million US. This is in 2020. It's like, hang on a second. So a stock listed company run by someone that's devoted their entire life to building that has just bought as much Bitcoin as they could with their cash reserves with the intention to hold on to them forever. How many accountants would be involved in that? How many lawyers would be involved in that? Like, there's a lot of people that say, no, that's not possible. But he did it, right? And so I, as an investor, I'm like, whoa, this is really fascinating that that's even been allowed. And that was what really kickstarted my experience of like, okay, you own some Bitcoin, but it was a small percentage of the total portfolio. What is this thing? And, boom, down the rabbit hole you go. Since 2020, you've then seen MicroStrategy just picking up speed. And I still don't own any MicroStrategy equity, to be very clear about that. But they have used a lot of different tools that are actually not very easy to acquire, and you could almost call it skills, that are available to a publicly traded equity that I, as an individual, do not have. And so I saw a statistic relatively recently that showed that the average cost of debt that MicroStrategy has been able to get its hands on in the last 4 years is under 1%. Now, if I go to the private markets here I'm actually in Bali at the moment, but in Australia where I live, I'll get quoted 9.5% for a 12 to 18 month loan that's leveraged against a piece of real estate, right? A publicly traded company is getting it at 0.85%, I think it was. Absolutely wild how cheap that is. And they've been able to raise additional cash through debt, so issuing bonds, and they've been able to raise additional cash through selling equity. And it's mainly those two levers that have enabled them to keep accruing more Bitcoin. So after the first play of like, okay, well, how much cash have we got? We've got, $300-400 million. Let's buy as much Bitcoin as we can. And then it was like, okay, well, how can we get more cash? Well, we could issue more equity. Oh, well, we could actually take on a load of debt. And there's been an extraordinary piece of financial engineering done in order to amass hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin at this point. And so exactly how they've done this, I'm not going to the details of it now. And again, I'm not an owner of MicroStrategy equity, or as it's now called, strategy. So go and do your own research, figure out if it's something that you actually want to be a part of. But what they've pioneered is something called Bitcoin yield. And so one of the difficulties that a traditional value investor will have is they're looking for yield on assets. And if they don't see a yield, they're like, how do I value it? And so a traditional value investor is unlikely to hold much gold, for example. They're like, well, it's just an asset play. I don't get any cash flow out of this. It has no yield. Therefore, to me, it's not valuable. And in some ways, you've got a yield play, and in other ways, you've also got a capital growth play. And what's interesting about this, it's like, okay, well, MicroStrategy can actually potentially give you both through the financial engineering that it's actually doing. And in some ways, I'm like, shit, I wish I bought some MicroStrategy like 4 or 5 years ago now. But my focus has been entirely on Bitcoin and self-custody. And where this now sits is like, okay, someone like Jesse, OnRamp was a custody solution. I don't know the story as to why he's no longer involved in that business. And now he's part of this company, Moon, that's based in Hong Kong. But what you're seeing is MicroStrategy copycats. And so they are equities, so portions of a company that people are selling with the express strategy of like, we're going to take on Bitcoin in the same way that MicroStrategy are doing. So they're going to use leverage, they're going to issue equity, and presumably also some real world Bitcoin infrastructure to actually back that up as well. But in Japan, there's another company called Metaplanet that has done extraordinarily well using a similar strategy. There's the company that runs the Bitcoin conference, Bitcoin Inc. They have a private equity / venture capital fund called UTXO Management. And they have basically taken the MicroStrategy play and copied it with Metaplanet. And you're seeing other copycats pop up. I'm also an investor in a company called Matador. Shout out to Mark Moss in particular that helped me get involved with that. And I bought pre-IPO equity, which at 50 Canadian cents a share is very, very volatile, don't get me wrong, but has now got up to like, I don't know, 75 cents, 80 cents or something at one point. So it's starting to look really quite a promising investment that I've made. But the way that I looked at it was highly speculative, right? I don't know which one of these equities is actually going to necessarily be the winner, if there is a winner takes all. I think the obvious point is that these companies are able to maximize returns based on geographical nuance. So one of the reasons Metaplanet has been such a success is because there's a load of cash that's tied up in a regulated space in Japan that wasn't able to access Bitcoin, that wants Bitcoin exposure, and in particular, Bitcoin yield. And so if an equity is able to offer that, well, then happy days. And suddenly you've got bond traders that can get involved in getting Bitcoin exposure. Like a bond trader is not going to go and buy an ETF, but they can buy a bond off a publicly traded equity. And I think the point here is that the Bitcoin Treasury play is so early that we don't quite know what the right model is going to be, but there's extremely interesting demand from public market equity investors for similar businesses to MicroStrategy, to Metaplanet, to Matador. And there's others. Semler Scientific is another business I've seen spoken about highly. It kind of makes sense. And now Jesse's joined Moon. So you're like, oh, wow, what would an equity investment in Moon look like? Well, they're based in Hong Kong. I'm absolutely confident UTXO Management involved again there, that they're not choosing geographic locations by mistake, right? And it's like, okay, this is interesting. As an investor, how do I get involved? And it immediately made me think about the Australian stock market. So at the ASX, like who's actually doing this in an effective way in Australia? And I have yet to see a good example of that. There's one company that was potentially publicly traded, but they don't look like the kind of team with the expertise that I'm looking for specifically. The idea is the Bitcoin Treasury company industry is at its very, very nascent stage. And what might it look like in the future? I don't know. But when you see people that you respect, who you're able to leverage the choices they make to make your own decisions, well, you better take notice. So I for sure will continue to look for Bitcoin equity investments to make, like the one I made in Matador. Full disclosure, for me, it's still highly speculative. And so I much, much prefer Bitcoin in self-custody. You take on counterparty risk. To make my Matador investment, I was making a cash transfer internationally using TransferWise. It took a number of days. The cost was high. I then have to trust that if I contact that company again, I'll get my money back. Now, it's obviously a regulated entity trading through a Canadian stock exchange. You'd expect that to actually work if you went to get your money, but it's different, right? You own an equity in a company. It's not owning a piece of the Bitcoin network in self-custody.